Well, good evening and welcome to our May meeting, and welcome also to those who are taking part online. I should explain that we'll be having questions and discussions at the end, and for those online, if you just raise your hand or put your question in the chat, then you can take part too. As many of you know, I send a monthly newsletter out saying what's going on in the philosophy group, and many of you will already be on it. But if you're not and you would like to be, then please come up at the end and put your name and email address on this clipboard. I should also mention the fire precautions. They're very simple. We go back down the stairs we came up, we go out and we turn right, and we assemble on a little piece of grass down there on the right. We changed that from assembling on the square because we don't want people crossing the road in a panic. Anyhow, this evening it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Raymond Tallis once again. He's a philosopher and a great many other things as well. He was until recently a physician and clinical scientist. And The Economist's Intelligent Life magazine has actually listed him as one of the top living polymaths in the world. He makes regular appearances and doing lectures, and he's written many books. He also writes regularly for Philosophy Now. And it's a great privilege to have him here this evening. So, Raymond, I'm looking forward to what you have to tell us.
Oh, Don, thank you very much indeed, and Andreas for having me back. I think this is either the third or the fourth time, which must be a triumph of hope over experience, I guess. So thank you very much indeed for having me back. Terry and I, we love being in Bath. I still can't pronounce it. I suppose it should be Bath, but coming from the north, we're always in a hurry, so we can't spend a lot of time on, vowels like A and so on. But it's fantastic to be back, and we've loved the previous occasions, and it's nice to be back in the flesh. Thank God, online's all right, but face-to-face is the real thing. So I thought I'd take a big risk and talk about reality, which is after all, the central philosophical preoccupation. Well, let me press the knob to make sure it all works. Sorry about this. No. It worked beautifully before. No? Oh. This meeting's been recorded by host or participant. It worked fine before, didn't it? Yes, it shows induction is always a dangerous business. Yeah.
Let's try. Let's try that and that and I'll try.
Ah, thank you. First of all, a trigger warning. This talk is a tour, not an argument. It will not lead to a conclusion. So if you want your money back at the end, I suggest you talk to Don about getting at least some kind of rebate for not getting your money's worth. What's the problem about reality? What's the concern? What's the worry? What's the suspicion? What's the hope behind the philosophical preoccupation with reality? Well, it's not just that we've got some things wrong, but that we've got everything wrong. That reality, excuse me, as we know it, as an illusion, an hallucination. Being awake, just another dream. More sustained, of course, more plausible, but no less a dream, even for being shared and collected. Now, there are many sources of the unreality thesis. The suspicion that what we think is real is not real has haunted humanity so long as it's been articulating thoughts about its situation. There are religious and spiritual beliefs that all will be revealed after death, and the truth is in the keeping of the gods or God. I'm not going to deal with that at all. I'm going to deal with philosophical arguments, with science suggesting that we may not have a grasp on reality, and scientific philosophy that embraces science as if it were the final answer to what is the case. That's what I'm going to talk about. the sources of the unreality thesis, philosophical arguments, science, and scientific philosophy. Of course, the question of what is real and the suspicion that what we think is real isn't is probably the most long-standing and indeed the widest preoccupation of philosophy and philosophers. I'm going to go right back to the beginning of Western philosophy. I don't know anything about Eastern philosophy other than what, average person knows. I'm going to say a little bit about probably the greatest philosopher in the Western tradition, Parmenides. And they say something about his footnote, Plato. Cheeky or what? In 2007, I think it was, I published a monograph on Parmenides called The Enduring Significance of Parmenides, Unthinkable Thought. And I'll explain the subtitle in due course. What did Parmenides say? He said that changing appearances, the dynamism of what we see in front of us, conceals an underlying, unchanging reality. And I want to take you through his argument, and you really have to concentrate because it's such a condensed argument. If you blink, you'll miss it. And his argument is set out in his poem on nature, and Greek scholars tell me it's probably the most unpoetic poem that anybody, short of Patience Strong, put to paper. So what did he say? Well, he starts off by saying something pretty reasonable. What is not, is not. Nothing can come out of what is not, so there can be no generation. Nothing can go into what is not, so there's no destruction. From which you conclude there can be no change, because without generation and destruction, there's no change. The totality of things is unchanging. So our appearance of a dynamic, changing world is an illusion. It's illogical. And of course, the past doesn't exist. And the future doesn't exist yet, if at all. Given that what is not, there can be no past or future. It gets worse. What separates one object from another? What separates bits of being from other bits of being? Well, it must be nothing. But nothing cannot generate a separation between things. What is not, is not. So whatever is must be the contiguous neighbor of what is. The universe must therefore be a continuum. Gets worse still. Being either is or is not. You can't dilute being with what is not. You can't have degrees or kinds of being. So all beings must be the same. So, contrary to what we see, the reality we apparently encounter, the truth is that the sum total of things is a single, unchanging, timeless, undifferentiated unity. It doesn't look like the world we know or think we know. And by setting out that argument in a very short, you can read the collected works of Parmenides in a quarter of an hour. By that argument, he really basically set the agenda for Western philosophy. And by the way, he's not out of date. You'll recognize this character. It was Karl Popper who said of Einstein that he was a Parmenidean, and Einstein embraced this title very happily. Because actually, if you think about the general theory of relativity, what is a spatio-temporal continuum. It is a block. And it was Hermann Weyl, great philosopher, great physicist, who says that seen through the eyes of contemporary physics, in particular the general theory of relativity, the objective world simply is. It doesn't happen. It doesn't unpack itself. Only to the gaze of my consciousness, crawling upward along the lifeline of my body, does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image in space, which continually changes in time. But this is an illusion. Reality is a frozen block. Plato, Parmenides' footnote, actually embraced what Parmenides had to say, didn't quite acknowledge Parmenides as much as he should do, and one of his worst dialogues is the Parmenidean, which was thought by some people to be almost a parody. But Whitehead said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Okay, but Plato is a footnote to Parmenides. Parmenides said, when people said, well, hang on a moment, I can see things changing, I can hear them changing, and so on, he said, do not be guided by your dull eyes, nor by your resounding ears, but test all things with the power of your thinking alone. Hold on to this central logical idea. What is not, is not. End of story. And Plato echoed that he saw the world as it appears to our senses is filled with error. Hidden behind this is a more perfect realm, populated by eternal changeless forms. And I guess pretty well everybody in this room will be familiar with one of the central moments in Platonic philosophy, the allegory of the cave. Just in case you don't see what a cave is, here is a picture of a cave. So what is our situation as human beings? Well, we have our back to reality. There's a fire going behind us, and what we see is the shadows cast on the walls of the cave. And we mistake them for reality. Don't trust your senses, by the way. Thank you, Parmenides. And he says we'll no longer make that mistake when we've been educated philosophically, when we've learned to think. Let's go back to Parmenides. So what of his legacy endures? Well, the first thing is this homogenizing intuition. Being is being. Any differentiation within being is an illusion. And that gave birth to Democritus's atomic theory. And that atomic theory, of course, has lived and grown and is one of the central concepts, of modern science. Richard Feynman, when he was asked, what message would you leave to Martians coming to this planet about what we know about this planet, he would say there's just one message. Everything is made of atoms. These are small things that are all identical with one another. Everything is made of the same things. Underneath, everything is the same. And we can look at a bit more detail. Everything is either matter or energy. But actually, matter and energy are interchangeable. Think of that famous equation with which we're all familiar. E equals mc squared. Energy equals matter times the speed of light squared. Everything is the same. So clearly, we've got things terribly wrong. Beneath the drunkenness of things being various, beautiful line from a poem by Louis Mendes is the sober monotony of things being the same. Everything else is an illusion. I want to jump now, frog in the throat, to some early modern philosophy, where distrust of the senses, the notion that the appearance of things was a veil actually concealing things, that revelation was a concealment, became central to the arguments. And I want to alight on two characters with which you'll be familiar. One is Descartes, the other is Kant. Here's Descartes. He said we should distrust our senses. Why? Well, in his famous discourse on method, he said, whatever I have up till now accepted as most true and assured, I've gotten either from the senses or through the senses. But hang on a moment. From time to time, I've found that the senses deceive. And by the way, it's prudent never to trust completely those who've deceived us even once. And you'll be familiar with his other argument, which is dreams seem real. So how do I know I'm not dreaming? How do you know you're not dreaming at the moment? And in a minute, you'll wake up. So that was Descartes, undermining our claim to have access to reality. He was able to escape from that solipsist bubble by saying, of course, God is good and he wouldn't deceive us. So a good God basically wouldn't deceive us. So in that sense, he escaped, if you like, from the bubble which he had, as it were, placed around our experience of the world. And then we come to this character. I describe him as the Bach of Western philosophy. Think about Bach. He summarized all the music that came before him, and he influenced all the music that followed him. And that's exactly what Kant did. And he argued as follows, that sense experience was limited. Beyond what is revealed to us by our senses, what he called the phenomenal realm, the realm of phenomena, is the realm of things in themselves, the noumenal realm, and this lies beyond the reach of our senses. In fact, he said, he claimed that he'd made a Copernican revolution. Remember, Copernicus said that, sorry about the frog in the throat, I'm just going to have a good old clear. Hopefully the frog will now disappear. I hope no toad returns. He says that, thank you, the idea that our knowledge must conform to objects, that is to say, what we know is what's out there, must be replaced by assuming that objects conform to our knowledge. We impose on the outside world, as it were, its status as a collection of objects. Objects of knowledge are constructs out of sense experience. Sense experience subjected to what he called the forms of sensible intuition. And those two forms were space and time. There's no space and time in the noumenal realm, but in the phenomenal realm, we impose on the torrent of our experiences space and time. So we appear to see objects that are set out in space and endure in time. And those objects are also ordered under what he called the categories of understanding, such as being causally connected. That was in part a response to David Hume, whom he said awoke him out of his slumber. So all our knowledge actually begins in experience, but experience falls short of ultimate reality. We then impose on that experience the forms of sensible intuition, the categories of understanding. So we think out there are objects and events that are connected causally. He's even bolder. He says it's this synthetic power of the mind, which I've just described, is the lawgiver of nature. It is a result of the action of the mind that we believe out there is a natural world subjected to laws. So knowledge of what is begins with sense experience. Knowledge of what is ends with sense experience. What is, however, lies beyond sense experience. So although our sense experience is the primary source of our knowledge, and what we sense tells us what is real, we shouldn't trust our senses. What we count as real is really unreal. We see, of course, there are good reasons why the senses have a bad press. We see things incompletely. We also sense that we sense things incompletely. There's always more to come. Also, sense experience is interactive. The subject, with their properties, interacts with the object, with its properties. The properties of objects are therefore contaminated by the sensory object of the subject, whether it's the visual system, the auditory system, and so on and so forth. And then there is the perspectival nature of sense experience. How things look depends on the relationship between those things and the one who looks. I don't know whether anybody ever used to watch Father Ted, but it's absolutely brilliant. And you may remember, those of you who did watch it, Dougal. Dougal was quite puzzled by the world. He was quite a philosopher in a way. And there's a famous dialogue he's had with Father Ted. Dougal, those people over there are very small. Ted, no, they're not small. They're ordinary people, but a long way away. Oh, is that so, Ted? In other words, the phenomenal appearance of things depends very much on the status and location of the onlooker. However, not so fast, Dougal. Don't worry, because as Father Ted points out, we can see that we see things at a certain distance. We see things from a certain angle. I'm aware of that. I'm looking at the glass from behind and so on. We see things in a certain light. And of course, our visual experience is checked against other visual experience and other experience, such as touch, and so on and so forth. So we're not quite at the mercy of the perspectivality of our senses. But then other philosophers have worried that the senses may actually still not deliver objects to us. After all, sensations are mediated. There are mediators in the mind that are more mind-like than that which sensation is supposed to be about. And two examples include the ideas. Descartes said all we were aware of is the ideas in our mind, which are quite separate from the objects that they are ideas of. And in the 20th century, analytical philosophers spoke a lot about having sense data in our mind, mediators, to seem to get in a way between the subject and the object. And then there's other problems. First of all, there are so-called secondary qualities, which appear to be imported by the perceiving subject. Color, does that exist in the world in which there are no conscious subjects? What about taste, smell, sound, warmth, chilliness, hardness, roughness, softness, smoothness? They are not properties of the material world. They're things ascribed to the material world by conscious subjects. Sorry, I'll just go back a bit. So what's left? Well, all that's left are primary qualities. This argument goes all the way back to Galileo, John Locke, and so on and so forth. What are the primary qualities that belong to an object? Well, these are what remains when you peel off all these secondary qualities: size, shape, number, duration, motion, and position. So let's, as it were, try and burst the bubble of sense experience by focusing on primary qualities. But hang on a moment, what are these primary qualities? Actually, they're just quantities. Number, size, and so on, separated from secondary qualities, are just quantities. Okay, bring on measurement as a way of helping us to break out of the bubble of appearance. Enter stage left, science. We know at the heart of science is measurement. When you can measure what you're speaking about, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced to the state of science. Thus spake Lord Kelvin at the end of the 19th century. So, perhaps measurement can help us to escape from the subject, from subjectivity, from perspective. And certainly the result of quantitative science have been astonishing. Think about the power of prediction. Think about the power of its applications. Think about the generalizability of the quantitative laws of science from the laboratory to the world of everyday life. It'll say a little bit about the predictive power and about applications in everyday life. Think about the microscopic predictive power of science. If you compare calculating and measuring something like the magnetic moment arising out of the intrinsic properties of spin and electric charge of electron, those two things give results that agree to 14 decimal places. Wow. Let's go macroscopic. On the macroscopic scale, there is a consistent, seemingly robust account of the first moments of the universe, according to which, and I quote, "The universe began as a hot spot of energy, a tiny seed, 100 billionth of a billionth of the size of a proton, which then inflated exponentially, inflating by 26 powers of 10 in each of three spatial dimensions in 10 to the minus, sorry about the misprint there, in 10 to the minus 32 seconds, a hundredth of a thousandth of a millionth of a billionth of a trillionth of a second." So measurement is quite impressive. And then there's the power of application. Think about the universal presence of the technology based on fundamental science, the entire landscape of microelectronics that fills and shapes our days. I saw a figure the other day that said something like 15% of the GDP of America now depends on applications that came from quantum physics. And look at the things I can do, courtesy of science. I can talk to a friend in Australia without raising my voice, unless they irritate me. And courtesy of science, the present epoch of the planet is the Anthropocene. Such an impact have we made on the planet. And that's why Wilfrid Sellars, American philosopher, said science is the measure of all things. And why Hilary Putnam, in an earlier phase of his philosophy of science, said that really, we've got to take science seriously. We've got to believe it reveals reality to us, because realism is the only view of science that doesn't make its success a miracle. If science didn't reveal what is real, how on earth could it be so predictably and in other ways powerful? So we've now got perhaps a way out of this bubble of sense experience through measurement. Perhaps we're discovering something that Pythagoras argued way back when, that all is number. Or Galileo, who said the universe is written in the language of mathematics and its characters are triangle, circles, and other geometrical figures. Or Sean Carroll, and I would recommend you listen to his Mindscape podcasts, they're absolutely brilliant, who said, reality is a vector in Hilbert space. It's all numbers. And by the way, if anybody wants the slides, I'm very happy, Don, through you or Andreas, to send the slides on to everyone. So the truth about reality is that the world is a system of magnitudes. Mathematics is not just a tool or a model, but reality itself. As Max Tegmark, in his absolutely crazy book, The Mathematical Universe Hypothesis, said, light boils down to numbers at space-time points that are also numbers. Whether we go that far, we must at least take the scientific world picture seriously. And we must do so even if its image of the world is profoundly different from what we experience as we go about our daily business. And I want to talk to you about Eddington's two tables, a most beautiful introduction to the Gifford lectures he gave back in 1927. He opened his Gifford lectures by saying, I've settled down to the task of writing these lectures and have drawn up my two chairs to my two tables. Two tables? Yes, there are duplicates of every object about me. Two tables, two chairs, two pens. Now, one of these two tables has been familiar to me from earliest years. It's a commonplace object of that environment which I call the world. How shall I describe it? It has extension, comparatively permanent, as tables are. It's coloured. Above all, it is substantial. By substantial, I do not merely mean it doesn't collapse when I lean upon it. I mean it's constituted out of substance. And by that word, I'm trying to convey some conception of its intrinsic nature. Thus, table number one. But he himself was a physicist and was aware that the same table could be seen quite differently. Table number two is my scientific table. My scientific table is mostly emptiness. Sparsely scattered in that emptiness are numerous electric charges rushing about with great speed, but their combined bulk amounts to less than a billionth of the bulk of the table itself. Think how small the nucleus of an atom is compared with the atom that encompasses all the electrons that used to be thought of as orbiting around it. There's nothing substantial about my second table. It's nearly all empty space. Space, it is true, pervaded by fields of force, but these are assigned to the category of influences, not of things. There is, however, a fundamental assumption behind this, the belief that ultimately reality is microphysical, a bit like Democritus' notion that everything boils down, and Richard Feynman, that everything boils down to atoms. That macrophysical reality, you, me, and the lamppost, the reality of enduring solid objects set out in space and time, is an illusion. So what conclusion have we reached? Is it the final word on the nature of reality is to be or will be pronounced by physicists when they arrive at a theory of everything? But essentially the notion that what the universe truly is a system of magnitudes. And alas, I have to say, that is a view being embraced by people who should know better. Philosophers, scientistic philosophers. I just want to distinguish between science and scientism. Science, thank heavens, is a disciplined, quality-quelled inquiry into the way things hold together, leading to our increased predictive and practical power. Thank you, science, for everything. Increased life expectancy, health expectancy, fun expectancy, etc. Against that is scientism, excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and its techniques. Science as the only way to the fundamental truths of the world. Philosophy then becomes throws itself at the feet of science and sees itself as the handmaiden of science. And one of the most brilliant expositions of this view is by James Lederman in a book called Everything Must Go, published in 2008, in which he said he embraced scientism as a badge of honor. And then in this rather difficult passage, he says that any new metaphysical claim made by a philosopher that's to be taken seriously at time t, how scientific is that, at time t, rather than now, should be motivated by and only by the service it will perform, if true, in showing how two or more specific scientific hypotheses, at least one of which is drawn from fundamental physics, jointly explain more than the sum of what is explained by the two hypotheses taken separately. In other words, basically, if philosophy has a job, and he's not sure if it does, it's about tidying up around the feet of physics. But let's think about the authority of measurement. What does it mean when what is becomes how much? Should we take seriously the notion that as a result of the power of measurement, we should believe that the universe essentially is mathematical? Should we, after all, be so unquestioning about the lowly state of sense experience and the hierarchy that places actual experience below primary qualities and ultimately mere magnitudes that are dealt with by science? Perhaps we should, after all, cheekily question the metaphysical authority of fundamental physics. Now, it doesn't mean to say that I'm not grateful to physics, thank you physics for the mobile phones and all that sort of stuff. What remains if we remove secondary qualities? Well, I think I've made it clear already, only numbers remain. So perhaps we ought to be suspicious of assigning such a lowly status to them. Why do we imagine numbers are more real than that which experience? Why do you imagine that describing blue as light of a particular wavelength uncovers or impeals the reality of blue? And by the way, is the dazzling brightness of light an illusion? So perhaps we ought to question the metaphysical authority of fundamental physics. After all, the journey to fundamental physics is paved by entities and experiences that basically are not encompassed, understood, or accommodated by fundamental physics. Physicists, with their bodies, their arguments, their design of experiments, their apparatus, actually lie outside the realm of fundamental physics. That realm lies beyond the reach of fundamental physics. So, Peter Higgs getting a train to CERN to see whether his suggestion of the Higgs boson reached the 5 sigma level of certainty, all of that is outside of physics. So there could be no physics if the world were as described as fundamental physics. Here's a lovely paper, and one that, if you've got a chance to read, seize it. It's by Eugene Wigner, a great, great physicist, got the Nobel Prize, I've forgotten when, in the 50s or 60s. But he wrote an extraordinary paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and Natural Sciences. Because mathematics is so effective, do we have to believe somehow that it is the last word on what is? No, he said, and that's impressive coming from a physicist. The argument, he said, that all physical things are left out from the laws of physics. He says the laws of nature are all conditional statements, and they relate only to a very small part, I beg your pardon, word missing, of our knowledge of the physical world. So classical mechanics, pretty harmless stuff, which is the best known prototype of physical theory, gives, here's the technicality, the second derivative, the positional coordinates of all bodies on the basis of the knowledge of positions, etc., of these bodies. But the important point is it gives no information on the very existence, on the actual positions, and of the actual velocities of bodies. Physics doesn't deal with actuality in that sense. In fact, maths yields more maths. Maths in, maths out. So a world of pure magnitudes that sets aside secondary qualities and everything else falls short of being a world. Indeed, if the world were made of pure magnitudes or mathematical structures, it would be difficult to see how there could be conscious subjects, such as physicists, such as the people who benefit from physics, standing outside of those structures, manipulating them in order to reveal them, and subsequently making use of them in technology. And by the way, there have been quite a lot of philosophers who feel that we have to listen to what quantum physics had to say about reality, but actually quantum physics is in a total metaphysical mess. I've spent a year and a half reading books on quantum physics, and that sense gets stronger and stronger. And I could give you a very irritating and boring talk on the theme of the metaphysical mess that is quantum mechanics. There's also, by the way, a very serious unresolved conflict between quantum theory and the other great contemporary theory, general relativity, about, for example, the nature of space. There's also the impossibility of interpreting quantum mechanics. Niels Bohr was an idealist. He said that things don't have definite values or even a definite existence except being measured. David Bohm suggested that actually we can sort out the problems with quantum mechanics by proposing that there are hidden variables. And then there's people like Everett and others who feel that we have to appeal to a multi-universe in order to explain the kind of observations that we see in quantum mechanics. But the important thing is scaling up to the world of macroscopic objects from quantum mechanics seems impossible. To reiterate something I've said earlier, quantum mechanics, if it was the sum total of the truth, would seem to remove the conditions that makes physics, including quantum mechanics, possible. And here's a nice quote from John Horgan, who is he's a very good popularizer of science. But in COVID, he decided he'd been a popularizer of science for too long and that he really needs to engage with the mathematics. And he spent a year studying the mathematics. Prior to that, he felt he'd be like a eunuch at an orgy. You know, he could see why people are getting excited, but he didn't know what the excitement was about. So he was determined to read the mathematics. And he spent a year or so in COVID. And he came out of that feeling that quantum mechanics is a black box. And I pick out quantum mechanics because it is the most powerful theory we have. From it, we get extraordinarily precise predictions, but we have no idea what happens to the black box. Quantum mechanics gives us power, but no answers. But that doesn't stop some philosophers or some writers from, as it were, throwing themselves at the feet of fundamental science, and in particular fundamental physics. And I want to give you an example of a philosopher who's widely quoted, he's absolutely everywhere, called Donald Hoffman. And 2 or 3 years ago, he published a book called The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. So he combines radical fundamental physics, which we've been talking about, with radical evolutionary theory to say that we have absolutely no access to reality. Why does he think that? Well, evolutionary theory, he says, tells us that fitness beats truth. The job of an organism is not to find the truth of things, but to discover or interact with the world in such a way as to maximize fitness. He also combines this with an appeal to quantum mechanics. Reality, says, according to one version of fundamental physics, is not composed of discrete objects set out in space and time. The fact that we see discrete objects set out in space and time, therefore, requires some explanation. And it is, he says, due to our foraging for fitness, for things that will promote survival. Objects seen in this way are not real. They're like the icons on a computer, not corresponding to what goes on either inside the computer or the world outside. Of course, this is a view that undermines itself, because if there are no objects set out in space, there are no organisms set out in space. There's no definite distance from other organisms, whether they are prey, food, or mates. And by the way, if there are no objects set out in time, there can be no mutation and selection over time. And by the way, no temporal differentiation between the parents and the offspring. Daniel Dennett, with whom I've had many disagreements over the years, wrote a book some of you may be familiar with called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And he said we'd rather underweighted the significance of what Darwin said. He said, the theory of evolution is a universal acid that eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview. But in Hoffman's, as you've seen, of Hoffman's hands, evolutionary theory ends up by eating itself. And radical anti-realism, really, or radical anti-realists, are in this position of soaring off the branch on which they sit. So let me take back some of the original premises of the talk. Take heart, lands in sight. Argument against the argument from illusion. A critique of generalizing unreality to everything. And an existential critique of the idea that we live or that we have no access to reality. It has an essential insincerity. Now, where does the argument from illusion take its rise from? Well, it assumes that we can recognize illusions, that we can acknowledge them, and of course we can struggle sometimes successfully to escape from them. But if the argument from illusion says that illusion is general, universal, it's not very clear how illusions are very specific, how they are localized. You and I know that this is an illusion. It's a unicorn, I think, and this isn't an illusion. We know that this is an illusion. This is not really a cube, and we can see it, as it were, wobbling back and forth as we have a series of visual illusions, and that this, I hope, is not an illusion. So that we need to go back to that argument from Descartes, when he says, whatever I have up till now accepted as most true, and assured I've gotten either from the senses or through the senses, but from time to time I've found that the senses deceive. And then he says it's prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. So this is his excuse for generalizing mistakes, errors, illusions, being deceived to absolutely everything. And clearly that's wrong. And it can be seen as wrong for linguistic and existential reasons. This is J.L. Austin, smoking a pipe, as all philosophers should do. And he pointed out that really, when we come to thinking about reality and unreality, it's the word unreality that wears the trousers. In his posthumously published lectures, he said, a definite sense attaches the assertion that something is real, a real such and such, only in the light of the way in which it might be or might have been not real. A duck may be asserted to be real against the counterclaim it was just a dummy, a toy duck, a decoy, or a picture of a duck. Reality is granted to an entity that meets certain criteria, and its reality is asserted where there is a possibility that someone might be making a mistake, a local mistake. And it is this sense that gives the idea of reality its borrowed force, a force that is on loan from the idea of unreality. There's also the existential case against reality. We can't take the case against reality seriously when we're running for a bus, sitting up all night with a crying baby, traveling to a philosophy conference on skepticism and making sure we've got the right train, or sitting for an eternity listening to a talk on reality by Raymond Tallis. In other words, existentially, anti-realism soars off the branch on which it sits. And yet, there are grounds for profound uncertainty. I don't know what kind of preacher I am. I don't know how I and other self-aware subjects fit into the order of things. Much that I don't understand. Much to be discovered that may not be discovered. So there is a kind of suspicion that anything, well, almost anything is possible. So perhaps I, and we collectively, have got everything wrong. Our confused notion of reality and unreality, and of fundamental truth and falsehood, show how awkwardly we fit into the world, in virtue of being sentient, sort of knowing, sort of understanding, world-picturing creatures. So on that note of in conclusion, the tour around the idea of reality concludes. So I thank you for your attention, or at least your courtesy in simulating it. Unless, of course, I'm dreaming, in which case I won't thank you. Thank you.
Andreas will now be looking at the questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Raymond. That was excellent, covering 2,500 years of Western philosophy.
Thank you.
Of realism, anti-realism. Is it true? Is it not true? I think there must be loads of questions. You know, are we really sitting here today asking questions of Raymond Tallis? It's a good one to start off with. But we'll start off with questions in the room, and then we'll go and ask some questions from the Zoom audience online. Who wants to go first with a question? We've got a gentleman here. If you could speak directly into.
So far, we've kind of been looking at reality from a singular perspective, but we kind of live in a social world of action, even if we don't speak, we are acting in a world with our entities. In what way might reality kind of emerge from the interaction of things and agents?
What a good question. It seems to me that we belong to a community of minds. And when we ask the question, what is real? Or we attend a conference on what is real, we are part of a community of minds which we really believe exist, which must therefore exist courtesy of a community of bodies living in a world set out in space and time. So the very fact we ask these questions basically reinforces our citizenship of this community. Does that quite answer your question? Do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I think it's the ultimate arbiter of what is reality often is the action that you take from the perception of reality. For example, if you're on the tree and you saw it through, and if your impression of reality is different, then the ultimate arbiter is going to be whether you fall to your death or not. So, whereas kind of a lot of the philosophy is based on perception. So it's like it is action underlooked in how we kind of determine reality.
Most certainly. And I mean, many philosophers have been inspired by the psychologist J.J. Gibson, who said the things we perceive are not just, as it were, representations, as it were, things to be spectated, but they're affordances. They're things with which we interact, things that have the possibility of action for ourselves and interaction with others. And there's a whole school of philosophical thought you may be familiar with of inactivism, which really wouldn't want to separate perception, knowledge, etc., from our engagement with the world in action. And that, in a sense, I guess, touches on almost the final slide, you know, that you can't believe in the theoretical unreality of what we perceive when you're running for a bus or looking after a crying baby and so on. Yeah.
No, but a very good point. There's more than subjects and objects. There's also the interaction between objects and subjects. So very good. Excellent. Does anybody...
Thank you very much for a most amazing talk.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned quantum mechanics, which does indeed muddy the scene quite a lot, as you have indicated, the black box. But there's quite a lot of discussion going on at the moment about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Chatbots, ChatGPT. If a machine can produce information, can produce an essay for a student, or can produce what appears to have been produced by a human mind, but it hasn't been, how do you take all that into consideration in your understanding of what is real?
Yeah. Gosh, I love that question. If I had a chance to plant a question, that would be the one I would have planted. So thank you. It seems to me that there's a big problem with the very phrase artificial intelligence. It assumes somehow that intelligence doesn't require initially phenomenal consciousness. But if it's developed, ultimately, it'll generate phenomenal consciousness. I don't believe that. I think so-called artificially intelligent machines are just algorithmic machines, and they don't actually have any kind of intelligence. In the same way as when I use a pocket calculator, this device in my hand doesn't calculate. I calculate using it. My phone doesn't make a phone call. I make a phone call and use it. As it were, the phone is the instrument. So I don't think we have, because we don't have conscious machines, and nobody's pretending we do at the moment, I don't think we can properly be said to have intelligent machines. Having said that, David Chalmers, who is probably one of the most influential philosophers of consciousness, has argued that basically there are aspects of consciousness that are separate from nominal consciousness, the sense of what it's like to be something, and he includes intelligence in that. But I don't agree with him any more than I agree with him in his use of information. The word information is so promiscuously spread about, isn't it? I mean, again, David Chalmers says that every time there's a causal interaction, there's a transmission of information. Gosh, it makes the universe, even before we arrived, a really gossipy sort of place, you know, exchanging. So I think we've got to be very careful when we use these, what I think are personifying images. So it's quite useful, such as intelligence, information, and so on. Well, I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that's being a bit sort of puritanical in our language? No.
Intelligent story involves an interaction with, whereas the machines are, they're generating not from anything outside, but just the artificial input of zeros and ones over and over and over in different patterns.
Absolutely right. I mean, they can, as it were, interact causally with what's outside them, just like a pebble interacts with a lake when it falls into it. But it doesn't have an outside with which it consciously and explicitly interacts. And you're absolutely right. Intelligence is something about interacting consciousness, creatures that are aware of themselves. Yeah.
I think we might have a slightly different opinion coming here.
I was reading an interesting paper which suggested that within the output of these large language models, you do have a representation of things like sound, pitch, and color, the secondary qualities that you had there. So just by ingesting and predicting the next token, they've somehow internalized a representation of sound and color, even without having access to that primary sensory information.
It's interesting you use the word representation. To me, there's no representation without presentation, without presence. So you need phenomenal consciousness to have presentation, and even more to have representation. And I guess the idea of a machine having some equivalent of the sense of red, just because it's responding to a particular part of the electromagnetic spectrum, I think again is personification. Is that unfair? Sorry.
We'll find out any minute now.
Can I first of all say thank you very much for your talk, which was very stimulating, and
thank
particularly
you.
enjoyed the answer to the question about artificial intelligence as well.
Oh, thank you.
What I'd like to question, though, is this idea of secondary properties,
Yeah.
which sort of dates back, I think, really to Locke.
Yeah.
I can't see that those secondary properties are any more secondary than the fundamental properties.
Yeah.
I think that there is perhaps a confusion with the fundamental units in physics, but it seems to me that warmth, colour, taste, etc., are just as measurable as anything else.
Yeah.
Because we measure them for a start.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think the whole concept of secondary qualities seems to me just to be irrelevant.
I agree with you. I mean, obviously, we are particularly associated with Locke, but it goes back to Galileo and before him to Democritus. I guess why are things like taste, colour, and the smell of cheese and so on regarded as somehow less real than size, number, and motion? It's because they appear to be more dependent on a subject. So, for example, in order for me to see the red in a tomato, I have to have a retina of a particular kind. You know, there's people who have red, green blindness and so on and so forth. So it does seem to depend on the subject in the way that size and number and motion don't, particularly when size, number and motion are actually measured. So I guess that's why these qualities are seen to be secondary. But I share your hostility to secondarism, the hostility towards secondary properties. But does that pick up what you said? Can I be sure that you feel happy with that answer? And
well, whilst we let him ponder, there's another question at the back, so we'll come back to.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but you can see why they're regarded as not the real thing, simply because they depend, for example, redness depends on my having the proper kind, a particular kind of retina.
They did. I think it was a lack of the scientific ability to measure those things at the time. Therefore, led to this confusion. Now we know we can measure. You can measure how red a tomato is. You can measure how sticky the tomato is.
But actually, when you measure it, the way you measure how red a tomato is, one is you can rely on the report of a subject. Gosh, that's jolly red, and that's less red. But usually, it's about which part of the electromagnetic spectrum is maximally affected, and that brings us then back to numbers. And electromagnetic radiation has no color, not until we arrive or beasts arrive. I mean, so in that sense, it looks as if they're very subject dependent, even though you can measure how red something is. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we've resurrected secondary qualities. Some people would even argue about the existence of primary qualities, but let's not get...
Absolutely. Well, you're quite right. In fact, in the book I'm writing at the moment, I say that they're just as vulnerable as secondary qualities.
But maybe we get to that later. So.
Thank you for your talk. I was struck by two things in your talk, and one was the Lord Kelvin quote about that rather bombastic quote about numbers, and I can't help thinking of I think he had an argument with sort of the evolutionists, because he said there wasn't enough time for evolution because he'd done the calculations and the sun could only have been around for 150 million years because they didn't know about nuclear fusion at the time. Right. And so his, he had the numbers, he thought he was secure, but actually he didn't understand the underlying mechanism. So the numbers can actually blind you to the reality.
Gosh, that's really interesting. So he was skeptical about Darwin, was he?
He was skeptical of the length of time that evolution was supposed to have, for gradualism to have been. I mean, he granted some time, but not enough.
Yes.
And then the other one was the Descartes quote saying, I'm never going to trust the senses if they've deceived me once. But in that argument of, Lord Kelvin, you can see, reason deceives us all the time. And what would we do without the senses? What mathematics and reason it would be completely blind and spinning on its own axis without any sense data or any sense perception. And I think it's a bit of a calumny against us sociable, evolved humans to think that you can only understand the world through a microscope, and kind of looking at our level is not really real.
That's very interesting. I agree. I mean, of course, what he said is what I can only be absolutely sure of is my sensations. And whether those sensations have intentional objects or not, I can't be sure. But thank God there's a God who won't deceive me, so all will be well. So he still has to put those things back in place, but he has to use the hypothesis of a God in order to put them back in place. But you're right. I mean, if he was sincere, I mean, who did he think he was talking to? What kind of objects was he sharing his intuitions with? Yeah.
Another question here at the front.
I can't help but wonder if I should have spent more time thinking about this before putting my hand up, but here we go. So if sensory reality is reality, if what we perceive some way is real, if we lack a sense, or through, say, narcotics, for example, we alter our senses, is that a limitation on that individual's perception of reality, or does that perhaps create a different reality, which is to say that if there is also stuff that is real beyond our perception of our senses, and this is the point where I think I should have spent time thinking about it, if there is stuff beyond our senses that therefore, oh no, I've completely lost it now. No, it's gone. Should we stick with the first part?
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
And it's a really good question. I mean, one of the things is that, of course, our senses are, as it were, validated by the massive consensus of humanity across cultures, etc., etc. And even though I might not see red, and I might see the world differently when I'm drunk, there is a kind of sort of consensus that makes my being drunk or not seeing red, as it were, a deviation. So there is that kind of consensus, which I think you were implicitly referring to. Yeah. Yeah. Does the second bit come to you, or?
Yeah, I'll give it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Consult your legal team in the meantime. That's it.
But I suppose Kant would have sort of argued that even though we have human consensus around what is real, given our faculties, we are limited by those faculties. And we can never be outside our human capabilities to perceive the world in a certain way. So all the science only perceives it through a human being or a group of human beings.
And that, in a sense, is the argument, the idea we are, as it were, condemned to a cognitive parish. Yeah. But my God, what a parish. Hundreds of millions of people over hundreds of years and so on. Yeah.
Yes. Just an observation about the quantum nature of reality.
Yes.
It has been thrown up that our idea of reality is that things can only be in one state at a time, and there we have quantum superposition, and a particle can be a wave and a wave a particle at the same time. That's totally against our sense of reality. And then the most difficult one is this action at a distance, where entangled particles retain their relation to one another, and then you can imagine experiment where the results of the experiment by one person conflict with the results of an experiment in another. There was a very rather complex argument given in a recent paper showing that this was possible, and then you have a conflict in reality.
Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, the second part was referring to the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen thought experiment, in which he's suggested that quantum physics, as Niels Bohr presented it, required there to be spooky action to distance, that particles would interact faster than the speed of light. And obviously, basically, Einstein took smelling salts at the very thought of that. But the other is the big central problem of quantum mechanics, the so-called measurement problem. If you believe quantum mechanics, then the unobserved universe is a Schrödinger wave of superposed possibilities. But whenever we wave a measurement, we get a precise value. So how do we get from the superimposition of multiple possible values to an actual value? And there are all sorts of so-called collapse theory. And nobody's got anywhere near it. And it's been, John Bell's wonderful essay called Against Measurement said, basically, the trouble is you're using these terms in quantum mechanics that have no place there, like measurement. It doesn't have a place in quantum mechanics. Let's deal with the sums, end of story, and shut up and calculate, as famously that David Merman said. But essentially, there is that fundamental problem that exposes the inability of quantum mechanics to account for our macroscopic world, in which definite things happen. Yeah.
Okay, there's a few questions online, so I'm going to read some out. One is by Tos Nichols. Fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
In discussing AI, you suggested there could be no representation without presentation. How would you describe the understanding of redness in those born without sight?
And that refers to a beautiful thought experiment by Frank Jackson. And he has this theory, he has this thought experiment of the scientist Mary, who's the world authority on vision. And she knows everything factual there is to be known about vision. but she's been brought up in a black and white world. So she's never seen red, even though she knows all about the theory of electromagnetic resonance and electromagnetism. And then the question is, what happens when she's suddenly liberated from this black and white room and enters a world where there are colors? Has she learned something new? In which case we would say that the objective physical account of the world was unclear, was incomplete. And I would say, in a sense, she has something new, but she hasn't learned it as a fact. She's turned facts into experiences. And I just wondered, just to be checked with your questioner, whether it was Mary, the 23rd century neuroscientist, who was in the background of that question.
Okay. Well, maybe Tos will come back on that. In the meantime, we've got another, actually it's more of an observation from Jeff Parks. I'm sure Richard Feynman said something like, reality is not only stranger than you can think, but than you think, but stranger than you can think. Yeah. Our human numbers and words will only ever be pale tokens for what is. Maybe we should all just relax and enjoy the ride. Wonderful talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Having said that, yes, I'm still eager to find out what's true. I mean, but thank you for the comment. Yes, yeah. I mean, I think the most depressing response to the paradox of quantum mechanics is shut up and calculate. It was originally ascribed to David Merman, who says he didn't, and then it was ascribed to Richard Feynman, and he said he didn't, because he himself was quite interested in what actually lay behind quantum mechanics. Yeah.
Good. More questions in the room, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Coming back to the sort of vexed question about sort of quantum mechanics, etc. It seems the problem is that maths works because it's the only way to describe these things. Otherwise, you try and use a language that has to do with this macro world, and you're just trying to describe, I don't know, you're trying to describe sounds by using colors, and it just will not work. And that is the problem. We have a mind that has grown up, on the plains of Africa in this macro world, and we cannot possibly use that mind and that language to describe something that reacts totally outside that. Therefore, the only answer is math, because math is the only way of understanding it.
But in the same, I would argue that maths doesn't describe anything. So when you get to E equals mc squared, I mean, if that was a selling point for a holiday, you think, I don't think I'll bother with that. I mean, as a description of the universe, nothing could be more empty than E equals mc squared, or the Schrödinger wave equation, or whatever. So in a sense, mathematics progresses by giving up on description. It's just pure quantification.
So could you argue that mathematics abstracts reality?
It abstracts from reality rather than abstracts reality. I would certainly agree with that. And of course, maths in, maths out, all the wonderful stuff that we have as a result of the mathematization of the world in the physics, in his portrait in physics. But in the end, I say it has drained, if you like, the world of any content. Yeah. Never mind things like pains and grumbles and so on.
Okay. Martin.
Thank you for a profound and very thought-provoking address that you've given us.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
It strikes my dull mind that we are talking here substantially of what might be called report. Information is, you could say, only report. It is uncontested report, but it is still and only is uncontested report. That has to be a big hitch in the world of what you've chosen to call fact. I'm not going to go into the meaning of the Latin word fact. It means that which is made.
Yeah.
But you're into slippery territory.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, a fact is that which is made, but not made up. I think it's quite important between the fact and also that information is report. And that really highlights something very important about information, is it's something shared between conscious subjects. That's why a causal interaction on the moon, contrary to what David Chalmers says, is not a transmission of information. It is definitely between conscious subjects. And facts are the products of making things explicit and articulating and shaping them. In that sense, they're made, but they're not made up.
Okay. We're coming up to the end of the session, but I'm surprised there's not more Heracliteans in the room.
More waters?
Heracliteans.
Ah, yes.
Heraclitus, and the flow of life. And you can't step into the same river twice because everything changes. We seem to have swallowed the Parmenidean story whole.
Well, the reason you can't step in the same river twice is sudden water have actually poisoned it in the meantime, since you last stepped into it. Yeah.
But I would have thought if what is not would entail us not actually us being here, because we are all the result of a union to actually arrive on planet Earth. But that's for another story.
And in fact, you could argue against Parmenides to say he's confusing the predicative and existential sense of being, but yes.
Good. Any other more questions? Otherwise, we're going to draw things to a conclusion. We're out on the online questions. So any last burning question in the room? Don, do you have one? No, nothing from Don. So should we draw it to a conclusion? Well, in that case, I hope you enjoyed tonight, and thank you very much indeed to Ray for a very exhilarating talk, very thought-provoking talk. I'll make sure that I get the presentation from him and then can send them to the people who've actually joined tonight.
Certainly, yeah.
But the only thing that remains to be said really is to say thank you to Raymond once again. So please put your hands together for an excellent talk.
Thank you.